Everyone thinks they know how King Ælla died. They picture the blood eagle, ribs carved from spine, lungs pulled through the back like wings, a Viking revenge ritual so brutal it became legend. But here's what actually happened on March 21st, 867. When the great heathen army took York, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it plainly. Both the kings were slain on the spot. That is it. No torture chamber, no elaborate ritual, just death in battle. So where did the blood eagle come from? Why does everyone believe Ælla suffered the most horrific execution in medieval history? And what does the evidence actually tell us when we strip away centuries of myth? York fell to Vikings in 866. Not a raid, an invasion. The great heathen army landed on the Isle of Thanet in Kent in 865. Roughly 3,000 men strong, according to estimates from the Great Heathen Army Studies published by Historic UK in November 2023. They came under three brothers, sons of a semi-legendary figure named Ragnar Lothbrok, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ivar the Boneless, Ubba. Their campaign would last 14 years and reshape England. Northumbria was first. The kingdom sat vulnerable, torn by civil war. Two men claimed the crown. Ælla, who had seized power sometime around 863 based on reign dating from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and Osbert, the deposed king. The Vikings arrived while these two fought each other instead of the enemy at their gates. They took York on November 1st, 866. The city, once Roman Eboracum, had become the capital of Northumbrian power. The Vikings walked in during the civil conflict and occupied it. For months, Ælla and Osbert kept fighting each other while a foreign army held their most important city. Not until spring did they wake up. March 867, they finally united their forces. The Battle of York happened on the 21st. Both armies met inside the city walls. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states the outcome with brutal simplicity. The Danes captured the city. Both Ælla and Osbert died in combat. Northumbria would remain under Scandinavian control until the mid-10th century. That is what the contemporary source says, written within decades of the event, by people who had reason to know what happened. No mention of torture, no ritual, just battle death. Two kings killed on the spot. So where does the blood eagle enter the story? In the sagas, Norse sources written centuries later, between 1190 and 1320, long after Christianity had transformed Scandinavian society. The tale of Ragnar's sons, Ragnar's saga Lothbrokar, and the Orkney-Inga saga. These texts claim something very different happened to Ælla. The sagas say Ivar the Boneless carved an eagle on Ella's back. They caused the bloody eagle to be carved on the back of Ælla. According to one translation, they cut away all of the ribs from the spine. And then they ripped out his lungs, a revenge ritual. Payment for Ælla supposedly throwing Ragnar Lothbrok into a pit of venomous snakes. That story, by the way, sits only in the sagas too. No contemporary source mentions Ragnar dying in Northumbria. No contemporary source even confirms Ragnar Lothbrok existed as a single historical person, rather than a composite legend. But the sagas needed a reason for the blood eagle, so they invented one. A father killed by snakes, sons taking revenge through ritual torture. If you value documented medieval history like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual. Using sources from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entries for 866 through 867, cross-referenced with the Battle of York archaeological records updated as recently as September 2025 on the Battle of York Wikipedia documentation, and the 1984 landmark Oxford University academic paper by Roberta Frank titled Viking Atrocity and Skaldic Verse, The Rite of the Blood Eagle, published in the English Historical Review, volume 99, issue 391, which examined the linguistic evidence for the blood eagle in Old Norse poetry and concluded the ritual descriptions likely emerged from poetic mistranslation. Now back to the information. 9 accounts of the blood eagle exist across Old Norse and Latin sources. 9 times the ritual appears in medieval texts. Every single one comes from sources written at least 2 centuries after the events they describe. Not one contemporary witness, not one account from someone who was there. The earliest reference sits in skaldic poetry from the late 10th or early 11th century. Even that is not eyewitness material. It is poetry using compressed, metaphorical Old Norse that scholars have argued about for decades. Because here's the thing about Old Norse poetry. It does not work like modern writing. Kennings, they call them. Metaphorical compounds that describe one thing by referencing something else entirely. An eagle of blood could mean an eagle feeding on blood on a battlefield. It could mean carving an eagle shape. It could mean something else entirely. The language allows multiple readings. Roberta Frank Marie Boroff, professor of English at Yale University, published her analysis in 1984. She examined every blood eagle reference in the sagas and skaldic verse. Her conclusion appeared in the English Historical Review, one of the oldest and most respected historical journals in the English-speaking world. The blood eagle, she argued, arose from misunderstanding poetry. The original skaldic verses likely described ravens and eagles feeding on corpses after battle, standard Viking Age battlefield imagery. The beasts of battle. Scholars call this trope. Wolves, ravens, eagles appearing in poetry whenever describing combat. They eat the dead. That is their role. But later, saga writers, writing centuries after Viking raids ended, did not fully grasp the poetic language anymore. They read metaphorical descriptions of eagles on the battlefield and interpreted them literally. They thought the Vikings were carving eagle shapes into human backs, so they wrote detailed torture descriptions based on their misreading of old poetry. This interpretation explains several puzzles. Why no contemporary sources mention the blood eagle? Why the ritual only appears in texts written long after Viking Age warfare ended? Why the descriptions vary so much between different saga accounts. Some describe ribs cut from the spine. Some mention salt rubbed into wounds. Some include lung removal. Others do not. If this was an actual practiced ritual, you would expect consistency. Instead, you see different authors embellishing a story they only half understood, adding details that seemed appropriate for a horrific torture method. The sagas were entertainment. They were meant to shock, to impress, to create memorable stories. Historical accuracy was not the goal, but the debate continues. A 2022 study took a different approach, published in Speculum, a journal of medieval studies in January 2022. Researchers from Keele University in England asked whether the blood eagle was anatomically feasible. Monty Gates and Heidi Fuller, medical scientists, teamed with Luke John Murphy, historian of religion at the University of Iceland. They used anatomical modeling software to simulate what would happen to a human body if the torture was performed as the sagas describe. Their findings, reported in the Smithsonian Magazine article published August 3, 2023, titled, "Did the Vikings Actually Torture Victims?" With the brutal blood eagle, showed the ritual could be done, but barely. The victim would die quickly from blood loss or suffocation unless performed with extreme surgical precision. Even then, death would almost certainly occur before completion. The torturers would need specialized tools, hooked spears to separate ribs from spine without immediately killing the victim, knowledge of human anatomy far beyond what battlefield warriors typically possessed, and they would need to work fast before shock and blood loss ended everything. The study concluded the blood eagle was possible, not that it happened, just possible. The researchers emphasized that the ritual, as it exists in popular culture today, owes much to Victorian scholars who were keen to exaggerate its role to emphasize the barbarity of the past and civilized nature of their own time. This worked doubly well for Victorians, demonstrating the superiority of native English over Viking invaders. The blood eagle became a propaganda tool, proof that Vikings were savage barbarians, unlike civilized modern Englishmen. Never mind that Victorians lived in an era of public hangings, brutal colonial violence, and industrial exploitation that killed thousands. They needed Vikings to be monsters so they could feel superior. The archaeological evidence for the blood eagle is exactly what you would expect if it never happened. 0. No skeleton shows the characteristic damage. No grave contains a body with ribs severed from spine in the pattern the sagas describe. And archaeologists have found plenty of Viking Age burials, thousands of them. Some show violence, sword cuts on bones, arrow wounds, blunt force trauma, normal battle damage. Not one shows blood eagle marks. If this was a practiced ritual, especially one performed on high-status enemies like kings, you would expect to find evidence, bodies buried with honor despite the torture, or bodies dumped in unmarked graves that later archaeology uncovered. Something. Anything. There is nothing. Compare that to other Viking practices we know happened. Slavery. The evidence for that is everywhere. Dublin and Hedeby and Birka all show signs of major slave markets in the archaeological and written record. Coins from the Islamic world found in Scandinavia came largely from slave trade. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who traveled to Viking settlements on the Volga River in 922, described the slave trade and funerary practices in detail. His account, written by someone who was actually there watching events happen, matches what archaeology finds in graves, human sacrifice at high-status funerals, servant burials alongside wealthy dead. The physical evidence confirms what he described. That is what contemporary sources plus archaeology looks like when something really happened. Or take dental modifications. Some Viking Age skeletons from Sweden, Denmark, and England show filed grooves in the front teeth. horizontal lines carved into the enamel. Why Vikings did this remains unclear. Fashion? Probably. Intimidation? Possibly. But the evidence sits right there in the bones, dozens of examples, enough to prove this was a real practice even though no written source mentions it. The sagas talk about far more dramatic things, but say nothing about tooth filing. Meanwhile, archaeology reveals the tooth filing clearly. This shows what happens when practices are real versus when they are literary invention. Real practices leave evidence even without written records. Literary inventions appear in written records without physical evidence. The same pattern holds for holmgang, the Viking duel practice. Multiple sagas describe it. Law codes from Iceland and Norway mention it. The rules are consistent across sources. Challenge to single combat. Must happen within 3 to 7 days depending on the law code, specific locations, often islands or marked grounds. The loser faces death or shame. Archaeology has found some possible holmgang sites based on landscape features and place names. More importantly, the written sources from the actual Viking Age mention it, not just later sagas. When something was really practiced, you get contemporary mentions, legal references, consistent descriptions, and at least some physical evidence tying to the practice. The Blood Eagle has none of this. What it has is entertainment value. The sagas were meant to entertain. They mixed real history with legend, historical figures with mythical events, accurate details with dramatic invention. They are valuable sources, but must be used carefully. Historians cross-reference them against contemporary sources like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, archaeological finds, and other evidence from the period being described. When saga claims match this other evidence, historians give them more weight. When saga claims appear nowhere else and contradict contemporary sources, they are treated as likely invention or distortion. The Blood Eagle falls firmly in the second category. Contemporary sources say Ælla died in battle. The sagas, written centuries later for entertainment, say he was ritually tortured. Which account do you trust? The one written close to the events by people with access to witnesses, or the one written generations later by authors crafting dramatic tales? Historians overwhelmingly trust the contemporary account. Ælla died on March 21st. 867 onward, killed in combat during the Battle of York. That matches how medieval warfare worked and how kings died, and what sources from that time period describe. But here is where it gets interesting. The Blood Eagle story, even if invented, tells us something important about Viking culture. Or rather, about how later generations of Norse people wanted to remember and portray their ancestors. The sagas were written after Scandinavia converted to Christianity, between roughly 950 and 1150, depending on the region. By the time the Orkneyinga saga and Tale of Ragnar's Sons were composed in the late 12th and 13th centuries, the Norse world had changed completely. No more raids on England and France, no more pagan temples and sacrifices to Odin. The Viking Age was over. These later Christian Norse writers looked back at their pagan ancestors with mixed feelings. Pride in their strength and achievements, horror at their paganism and violence. The Blood Eagle served both purposes. It showed Vikings as powerful and terrifying, capable of extreme vengeance against their enemies. It also showed them as pagans engaging in barbaric, un-Christian practices that the saga audiences could feel superior to. This matches what historians call memorial culture. How societies remember and reshape their past to serve present needs. The Vikings of the sagas are not the Vikings of history. They are literary constructs, built from real historical fragments mixed with legend, religious commentary, and entertainment. The Blood Eagle is part of that construct. It is too perfect, too symbolic. An eagle, Odin's sacred bird, carved into an enemy's back, wings of bone and flesh, a sacrifice to the god of war. This is mythology, not history. Real torture is banal and ugly. It does not have symbolic perfection. The Blood Eagle is too much like a ritual from legend, which is exactly what it is. Ivar the Boneless himself is half legendary. Contemporary sources mention him. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls him Ingvar and places him with the great heathen army. Irish annals mention him too. He was real. But the nickname Boneless? That comes from the sagas. No contemporary source calls him that. The sagas offer different explanations for the name. Some say he had a bone condition making him unable to walk, so warriors carried him on a shield into battle. Some say it meant he was extremely flexible or agile. Some modern historians think it might be a mistranslation or garbling of his actual nickname. Whatever the real Ivar was like, the saga version is heavily fictionalized. The man who supposedly performed the Blood Eagle on Ælla is himself partly fictional character, and Ragnar Lothbrok, even more legendary. Some historians think he is a composite of several different historical figures, whose deeds got combined in later tradition. Others think he might have been one real person whose story attracted legends about other people. The sagas describe him as a great king and raider who had multiple wives and many sons who became famous Vikings themselves. But contemporary sources do not mention anyone matching his full saga description. There was a Ragnar who raided Paris in 845 Malzurst, mentioned in Frankish chronicles. Maybe that is the same Ragnar, maybe not. The story about him being thrown into a snake pit by Ælla appears nowhere outside the sagas. It is legend justifying legend. The fictional execution method requires a fictional reason, so the sagas invent the snake pit death to explain why Ivar would perform the blood eagle. This creates a chain of unsupported claims. Ragnar existed, maybe. Ælla killed him in a snake pit, definitely not according to any contemporary source. Ivar performed the blood eagle as revenge, contradicting the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which says Ælla died in battle. Each link in the chain is questionable, and together they form a story that is almost certainly fiction. But it is powerful fiction. It resonates. The blood eagle captures something about how we imagine Vikings: brutal, ritualistic, pagan, terrifying. It fits our mental picture, even though that mental picture is often wrong. Television shows like Vikings on the History Channel, which aired from 2013 to 2020, portrayed the blood eagle in graphic detail. First, when protagonist Ragnar Lothbrok executes Jarl Borg in the show's second season, then when Ragnar's sons execute King Ælla in season 4, episode 18, aired in February 2017. Millions of viewers watched these scenes. The show's creators based them on the saga accounts, treating those medieval stories as factual history. They were trying to be authentic to the sagas, but the sagas themselves are not authentic to 9th century history. The result is historical fiction presented as history, which then shapes how audiences understand the past. Video games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, released in November 2020, include blood eagle executions as dramatic set pieces. Players see detailed animations of the ritual. These portrayals treat the blood eagle as established historical fact. They do not mention the scholarly debate or the lack of evidence. For most people, these shows and games are their only exposure to Viking history. So the blood eagle becomes fixed in popular imagination as something that definitely happened, when historians remain deeply skeptical. The power of these portrayals should not be underestimated. Popular culture shapes historical understanding far more than academic books. When millions see the blood eagle on screen, dramatically lit and carefully choreographed, it becomes real to them in a way that academic papers saying it probably never happened cannot counter. This is not new. Every generation reshapes the Vikings to fit contemporary concerns and interests. 19th century scholars emphasized Viking brutality to make their own society seem civilized by comparison. Early 20th century writers emphasized Viking adventuring and exploration, seeing them as romantic frontier figures. Late 20th century historians emphasized Viking trade networks and craftsmanship, pushing back against the violence-focused image. Now, early 21st century popular culture has swung back to violence, but with a twist. Modern portrayals often show Vikings as having a complex honor code where brutal execution methods serve ritual and social purposes. The blood eagle in Vikings and Assassin's Creed is not random torture. It is shown as meaningful ritual, a culturally sanctioned response to specific offenses. This reflects modern interests in ritual style, meaning-making, and cultural differences more than it reflects Viking Age reality. But focus on Ælla specifically. What do we actually know about him? Very little. He appears in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as King of Northumbria starting around 863. Some sources say he deposed the previous King Osbert, though the details are unclear. By 866, both men claimed authority, meaning either Ælla was never fully accepted or Osbert tried to take back the throne. This internal conflict made Northumbria vulnerable when the great heathen army arrived. Ælla's reign lasted perhaps 4 years, maybe fewer. He died in battle in 867. That is essentially everything contemporary sources tell us about him. The sagas add much more. They make him a villain, a king who unjustly kills the great hero Ragnar, a man who deserves terrible vengeance. But these are literary additions, not historical facts. The saga writers needed an antagonist for their hero stories. Ælla filled that role. It is convenient that he died fighting Vikings and that his kingdom fell to Scandinavian conquest. Those facts let saga writers build a revenge narrative around him. But building a narrative around historical facts is different from those facts supporting the narrative. Ælla died fighting Vikings. That is true. Vikings killed him because he killed their father. That is not supported by evidence. The blood eagle was the method. That contradicts contemporary accounts. Strip away the saga embellishments, and you're left with a minor English king who had bad luck. He ruled during a civil war. A massive Viking invasion force arrived during that war. He failed to respond effectively until too late. He died in the resulting battle. This is not dramatic, it is not memorable, it does not make for compelling storytelling. So later writers added drama. They made his death spectacular and terrible. They gave it meaning and symbolism. They made it a focal point of Viking revenge legend. The real Ælla disappears under layers of later invention. This pattern repeats throughout medieval history. Real people become characters in stories. Their actual lives and deaths get reshaped to fit narrative needs. Often, historians cannot fully separate fact from fiction because the fictional versions were written down and preserved while contemporary accounts were lost or never existed. The Blood Eagle case is unusual because we have contemporary sources that contradict the later legend. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gives us a clear alternative account. Usually, historians are not so lucky. Usually, the saga version is all that survives, making it impossible to prove what really happened. But that raises a question. If the Blood Eagle probably never happened, why do the sagas describe it in such detail? Why do multiple texts mention this specific torture method? One possibility is literary borrowing. Once one saga described an eagle being carved into someone's back, later saga writers copied and expanded the idea. Medieval writers often borrowed from each other. They saw compelling scenes or descriptions in earlier texts and adapted them for their own stories. If the Blood Eagle appeared in one influential saga or poem, it could spread to other texts, even if it was invention from the start. The details might get more elaborate with each retelling, as authors tried to make their version more impressive than earlier ones. Another possibility is that the Blood Eagle was a legendary torture method that people in the medieval North talked about without it being a real practice. Legends about extreme punishments existed in many cultures: being buried alive, being boiled in oil, being flayed. These appear in various medieval texts, both European and Middle Eastern. Some really happened occasionally. Most were threats or stories rather than actual practices. The Blood Eagle might have been a Viking equivalent, something people claimed would happen to enemies, but rarely or never actually performed. The saga writers then reported these claims and stories as if they were historical events, or the origin might be even simpler. A poetic description of battlefield death got misunderstood. Roberta Frank's theory: a skald composed verses about an enemy whose back the eagle cut, meaning an eagle fed on his corpse after death in combat. Normal battlefield scavenger imagery. Later readers who did not fully understand the poetic style thought the eagle cut the back meant someone carved an eagle into the back. They turned metaphor into literal torture. Then each retelling added more details as writers tried to imagine what such a torture would involve. Ribs separated from spine, lungs pulled out, salt in wounds. These are things medieval people knew were extremely painful, so they added them to make the torture as horrible as possible. All three explanations might be partially true. Poetic misunderstanding created the initial concept. It became a legendary torture people talked about. Saga writers borrowed it from each other and embellished it. The result is 9 accounts of something that never happened, or at most happened once in a way, very different from how the sagas describe. The 9 accounts are not 9 pieces of evidence. They are 9 versions of the same story, each dependent on earlier tellings. This is crucial for understanding medieval sources. Medieval writers did not have modern concepts of plagiarism or original research. They freely borrowed from earlier texts. If they were writing about Vikings and wanted to describe a gruesome execution, they looked at how earlier writers handled similar scenes. If those earlier writers mentioned the Blood Eagle, the new writer would include it too, possibly adding details to improve the drama. The same story could appear in 5 different sagas written across 2 centuries. Modern readers see 5 separate accounts and think that means 5 separate confirmations. Medieval reality is that 5 accounts might all derive from one original source, possibly itself fictional. Scholars call this the problem of dependent sources. You cannot count each version as independent evidence. You have to trace back and see if they all depend on one earlier text. For the Blood Eagle, all 9 accounts seem to connect to skaldic poetry from the 10th or 11th century. That poetry is ambiguous. It uses compressed, metaphorical language that can be read multiple ways. Later, saga writers interpreted it as describing a torture ritual. Modern scholars interpret it as describing ravens and eagles feeding on corpses. Neither interpretation can be proven definitively correct from the poetry alone, but only one interpretation matches contemporary non-poetic sources about how Ælla died. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says he died in battle. That matches the battlefield scavenger interpretation of the poetry. The torture interpretation contradicts the Chronicle entirely. When sources conflict, historians weigh them. How close in time to the events? Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entries for 866 and 867 were probably written within a few decades. The sagas were written 300 years later. How reliable is the source generally? The Chronicle is generally accurate about major political events like battles and deaths of kings, though it simplifies and has bias. The sagas mix history with legend routinely. What agenda might the source have? The Chronicle wanted to record events and perhaps make the Viking victory seem less shameful by emphasizing brave resistance. The sagas wanted to create entertaining stories about heroic ancestors. In every category, the Chronicle is more reliable for determining what actually happened in 867. But here is what historians have learned over decades of studying medieval sources. Just because something in a saga is not historically accurate does not mean it is not historically valuable. The Blood Eagle, even if invented, tells us about 13th century Norse culture. What did they think about their Viking Age ancestors? What kind of violence did they imagine those ancestors capable of? What ritual and symbolic meanings did they attach to execution and revenge? The sagas are windows into when they were written, not when they describe. They show us how Christian Icelanders in 1200 thought about pagan warriors from 867. That is valuable historical information, even though it is not accurate information about 867 itself. This is why historians do not simply dismiss the sagas as lies. They are complex texts that contain real historical memory mixed with legend, real cultural values mixed with literary invention, real places and names mixed with fiction. Untangling them requires care. For the Blood Eagle, the untangling points clearly toward invention, but that conclusion itself teaches us about saga composition, medieval storytelling, and the formation of legendary history. Meanwhile, the real story of what happened in 867 is less dramatic, but more interesting when you dig into it. The great heathen army was not a spontaneous raid. It was organized conquest. These Vikings came to stay. They brought smiths and craftsmen. They planned to settle land, not just plunder and leave. York became Jorvik under Viking rule, a major trading center that connected Scandinavia with England and Ireland. The conquest of Northumbria in 867 was step one in a transformation of English politics and culture that lasted centuries. Within a few decades, the Vikings controlled most of eastern England in what became known as the Danelaw. English kings spent generations fighting to reclaim these territories. The cultural mixing produced new art styles, new language influences, and new political structures. Modern English contains hundreds of words from Old Norse because of this period. Place names across northern England show Scandinavian origins. None of this has anything to do with the Blood Eagle. The real historical impact of 867 was conquest, settlement, and cultural change. The Blood Eagle is a footnote, a legendary addition that tells us nothing about what actually changed England. But it is the Blood Eagle people remember and the settlement patterns they forget. Drama beats historical reality and popular memory almost every time. In our last discussion, we established a clear and compelling case against the historical reality of the Blood Eagle. We saw how the only contemporary source, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, records King Ælla's death in battle on March 21st, 867. We traced the Blood Eagle story to its origins in ambiguous Norse poetry, written centuries after the fact and likely misinterpreted by later Christian saga writers who were crafting entertainment, not history. We noted the complete absence of archaeological evidence and contrasted it with the clear physical proof for other Viking practices like tooth filing and human sacrifice. The conclusion is stark. The image of Ælla's ribs being carved from his spine and his lungs pulled out like wings is almost certainly a legend, a powerful piece of medieval fiction. But that conclusion opens up an even more fascinating set of questions. If it never happened, why was it invented? What purpose did this story serve for the people who told it? And why, over 1,100 years later, does this brutal fantasy still hold such a powerful grip on our imagination? To understand the Blood Eagle, we must now move beyond a simple fact check and dissect the anatomy of the myth itself. What does this story tell us? Not about the 9th century, but about the 12th, the 19th, and even the 21st. The currency of revenge in the shadow of Odin. To understand the invention of the Blood Eagle, we first have to understand the culture that birthed it, the world of the 13th century Icelandic saga writers. These were Christian authors looking back at their pagan ancestors. Their relationship with that past was complex, a mixture of pride and revulsion. They admired the strength, daring, and street-lighting and ambition of the Viking Age, but as Christians, they were also compelled to frame that past as a dark, heathenish time that had, thankfully, been overcome by the true faith. The Blood Eagle was a perfect tool for navigating this duality. Revenge is the engine of most saga narratives. Honor was a tangible commodity in the Norse world, and an insult or injury to one's family had to be repaid, often with violence, to restore that honor. The sagas are filled with generations-long blood feuds sparked by a single killing. But the Blood Eagle is something more than a simple revenge killing. It is theatrical, it is symbolic, and its symbolism is deeply, darkly pagan. The key is in the name, the eagle. The eagle was one of the primary animals associated with the chief god of the Norse pantheon, Odin. Odin was the god of war, poetry, wisdom, and death. Ravens and eagles, the beasts of battle, were his companions, flying over fields of slaughter to feast on the slain. For a Christian writer in the 1200s, invoking this imagery was a powerful move. By having Ivar the Boneless carve an eagle onto Ella's back, the author does two things simultaneously. First, they portray the sons of Ragnar as terrifyingly powerful, capable of exacting a vengeance so profound it reshapes a man's body into a sacrifice for their war god. It is an act of ultimate pagan dominance. Second, they condemn the act as demonic and barbaric from a Christian perspective. The ritual is a perversion of the human form, an unholy rite performed in service to a false god. The saga audience could feel a thrill of horror at the brutality while also feeling secure in their own, more civilized, Christian present. The story allowed them to have their cake and eat it too, to celebrate the fearsome power of their ancestors while simultaneously thanking God they were no longer like them. This ties into the Norse concept of a good death. The ideal death was in battle, weapon in hand, which earned a warrior a place in Odin's hall in Valhalla. The worst kind of death was a straw death, stradouti, dying of old age or sickness in bed. But the blood eagle, as a literary invention, represents something else entirely, a death of ultimate dishonor. It is not a quick end in the heat of combat. It is slow, agonizing, and transforms the victim into a spectacle. In the logic of the sagas, Ælla is not just killed, he is unmade. He is turned into a bloody effigy, a tribute to a pagan god, denied any semblance of a warrior's end. For the saga's narrative, this was the only fitting punishment for a man who supposedly killed the great Ragnar Lothbrok in a dishonorable snake pit. It is myth answering myth, a cycle of legendary violence. Real atrocities versus legendary cruelty. The enduring power of the blood eagle myth has, ironically, overshadowed the very real, documented violence of the Viking Age. If the Vikings were not performing blood eagles, what were they doing? Contemporary accounts from their victims paint a grim picture, one that needed no legendary embellishment. Let us go back to the very beginning of the Viking Age, to the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in Northumbria in 793. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports that heathen men made lamentable havoc in the Church of God, miserably destroying and plundering everything. They trod the holy things under their polluted feet, dug up the altars, and carried off all the treasures of our holy church. Some of the brethren they slew, some they carried off in chains. Alcuin of York, a Northumbrian scholar at Charlemagne's court, wrote letters of horror back to England. Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race, he wrote. The Church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. Notice what Alcuin describes: slaughter, sacrilege, theft, and enslavement. It is brutal, shocking, and economically motivated. There is no mention of elaborate, ritualistic torture. The horror came from the suddenness of the violence and its location, an attack on a sacred, undefended center of Christian learning. This was the reality of a Viking raid, a terrifying and effective combination of military force and economic opportunism. When ritual did enter the picture, it looked very different from the blood eagle. The most detailed account we have of a Viking ritual involving death comes from an outsider, the Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan. In 922, he encountered a group of Rus Vikings on the Volga River and witnessed the funeral of a chieftain. His account is one of the most valuable documents from the Viking Age because it is a direct eyewitness report. He describes the chieftain being placed on a ship, surrounded by weapons, food, and the bodies of sacrificed animals. Then, a slave girl volunteered to be killed to accompany her master into the afterlife. Ibn Fadlan describes her being led to the ship by an old woman known as the Angel of Death. She was given intoxicating drinks, sang songs, and had ritual sex with several of the chieftain's men. Then, she was simultaneously strangled with a rope by two men and stabbed between the ribs by the Angel of Death. Finally, the ship was set on fire, becoming a floating pyre. This is a real, documented ritual killing. It is brutal, complex, and deeply rooted in pagan religious beliefs about the afterlife. And critically, we have evidence for it. Ibn Fadlan's description of ship burials and sacrificed servants matches exactly what archaeologists have found in high-status graves across the Viking world. This is what historical convergence looks like: a contemporary written text and the physical archaeological record telling the same story. The Blood Eagle has no such convergence. It exists only in literary texts, written long after the fact, with zero physical evidence to support them. Conquerors, not torturers. The real legacy of Ivar and his brothers. By focusing on the Blood Eagle, we risk reducing the sons of Ragnar to one-dimensional monsters from a horror story. The reality is that they were canny and ambitious political and military leaders. Their goal in England was not simply revenge, it was conquest. What happened after they killed Ælla and secured York in 867 demonstrates their true priorities. Ivar the Boneless, the supposed architect of the Blood Eagle, did not remain in Northumbria to dream up new tortures. He moved on. He solidified his power base and then turned his attention west, towards the Irish Sea. By the early 870s, he was based in Dublin, a major Viking port and slave market. The Irish annals refer to him as the King of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain. He died in 873, not in a frenzy of bloodlust, but apparently peacefully, as a successful and powerful king. His career was not one of a crazed ritualist, but of a brilliant and ruthless strategist who built a Scandinavian dynasty that would dominate the Irish Sea for generations. His brother, Halfdan, stayed in England. After several more years of campaigning against the kingdoms of Mercia and Wessex, he returned to Northumbria in 876. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports that he portioned out the land of the Northumbrians, and they proceeded to plow and to support themselves. This is a profoundly important and often overlooked sentence. The great heathen army ceased to be an army and became settlers. They put down their swords and picked up plows. Halfdan became the first Viking king of Northumbria, ruling from York, which was now transforming into the bustling Anglo-Scandinavian city of Jorvik. This is the true legacy of the campaign of 867. It was not a revenge mission that culminated in a single, gruesome execution. It was the beginning of the Danelaw, the large-scale Scandinavian settlement of England. It was about the acquisition of land, wealth, and political power. Ivar and Halfdan were not just raiders, they were state builders. Their actions permanently changed the political and cultural map of Britain. This story of settlement, assimilation, and the creation of a hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian culture is far more complex and historically significant than the simple, brutal tale of the Blood Eagle. But it is a story that is harder to tell in a 2-hour movie or a dramatic television scene. The modern life of a medieval myth. So why does the myth persist so strongly? Part of the answer lies with the 19th century Victorians, as we touched on before. They rediscovered the sagas and translated them into English, but they read them through the lens of their own biases. They saw the Vikings as savage, romantic barbarians, the perfect foil to their own self-image as civilized, industrial empire builders. The Blood Eagle was the ultimate proof of this savagery. It became a staple of popular histories written in the era, presented as undisputed fact. This image has proven incredibly durable. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the Blood Eagle has found a home in popular culture. Heavy metal bands use the imagery in their lyrics and on their album covers to project an aura of brutal, transgressive power. It appears as a plot point in historical fiction novels, television shows, and video games, often depicted with painstaking, graphic detail. Each depiction reinforces the idea that this was a real historical practice. These portrayals are not necessarily malicious. They are often based on a genuine attempt to be authentic to the saga sources. The problem is that the saga sources themselves are not authentic to the historical period they describe. The myth now serves different purposes for different groups. For some, it is simply a cool, edgy piece of historical trivia. For others, particularly in some neo-pagan and heathen communities, it is embraced as part of a reconstructed warrior ethos, a symbol of uncompromising strength. More troublingly, the image of the hyper-violent, blood-eagling Viking has been co-opted by white supremacist groups, who distort Norse history and symbolism to fit their own hateful ideologies. For them, the brutality is not a flaw but a virtue, a sign of a fictionalized racial purity and martial superiority. The myth has taken on a life of its own, far removed from the medieval texts where it originated. It has become a free-floating symbol of ultimate brutality, ready to be deployed by anyone who wants to invoke the dark and savage power of the Viking Age, the allure of the terrible tale. Ultimately, we believe in the Blood Eagle because we want to. History as a discipline is often a matter of careful, qualified statements, of weighing probabilities and acknowledging uncertainty. It is about understanding complex social and economic forces. A story about a king dying in a confused city battle during a civil war is historically accurate, but it is not a great story. A story about a king having an eagle carved into his back by the vengeful sons of a hero he murdered. That is a story that sticks. It is simple, primal, and visually arresting. It provides clear heroes and villains, It gives a chaotic and confusing historical event a neat, satisfying narrative structure: crime, pursuit, and punishment. The Blood Eagle transforms the messy reality of the past into something that feels like mythology. It makes the past more exciting, more extreme, and more meaningful than our own mundane present. The legend of King Ælla's death is a perfect example of the tension that often exists between historical fact and popular memory. The historical truth is that King Ælla of Northumbria was a minor king who reigned for a few chaotic years before being killed in battle by a superior invading force. He was a victim of bad timing and political circumstance, but in legend, he became an infamous villain who received one of the most gruesome punishments ever imagined. That legendary death tells us nothing about the realities of 9th century warfare. But it tells us a great deal about the power of storytelling, the construction of cultural memory, and our own enduring fascination with the savage glamour of the past. The Blood Eagle may be a fiction, but the human need for such fictions is a powerful historical force in itself.